Nature and the great outdoors aren't always that great, as you're about to find out. Just a quick note, if any of you are interested in the audiobook which I've produced, feel free to check the description. It's a quality piece of work and definitely worth your time, so feel free to take a look. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I have never gone camping or out into the woods at night after this trip. A few friends and I had a long weekend off from school, and we decided to go camping in the North Georgian mountains. We packed a big 10-person tent, as there were 5 of us, 2 guys and 3 girls, and loaded up my buddy's truck. He and I had some experience being outdoorsy / camping / hiking / hunting. He's an army vet, so we packed really well and had all sorts of amenities, like a propane stove / grill, fold-up cots, portable showers. We were in it for the whole weekend. We left Wednesday afternoon and parked the truck in a small town and started hiking into the woods to find a spot. It was a fairly normal hike until we got about 4 to 5 miles in. The first time we noticed something strange was when we came into a little clearing in the woods with a big pond / tiny lake in it. We step into the open area and everything stopped. No birds chirping, no squirrels running around. Even the clouds and wind seemed to stop moving. My buddy and I both thought, well shit, there's got to be a predator nearby, and took out our handguns just in case. I've never seen a bear in Georgia, so we figured it was a mountain lion, or maybe some coyotes. My friend and I were looking around the edge of the clearing, and he grabbed me. He nodded across the water, and when I looked, I saw what seemed to be a woman standing at the tree line. She was maybe 150 yards away. We assumed she must live somewhere nearby, and so continued walking past the water and clearing. As we headed back into the woods, I looked over my shoulder where she was standing, and she was gone. The sounds of the forest returned once we got into the trees. We made a campsite about 2 miles past that, as it was getting late, and we didn't want to be stuck building a camp in the dark. We got everything unpacked, and set up and built a fire, propped open a couple of beers, and just sat down to hang out. There was a girl I was interested in on the trip, and we had been flirting, so after a few beers and the sun was down, we snuck away from the fire, under the pretense that she wanted help setting up part of the tent. We started fooling around, and after a few minutes, she stopped and looked at me funny. I asked her what was wrong, and she said nothing. It just got really quiet. We both dressed quickly and headed back outside the tent. The others hadn't noticed anything strange, and didn't mention that anything was wrong, except joking with us that it took a long time to fix the tent. On the first morning, we found that the propane stove had been turned on, but not ignited, and had gone empty overnight, when none of us had used it. The second morning, we noticed some things had gone missing. A lantern we left outside by the fire was gone. My crush's sweatshirt she left on a little folding chair was gone. We figured that we had just misplaced things, or that someone had used them and put them elsewhere. During the second full day, Friday, we were looking for a waterfall that we read online was in the area. We were following the river upstream when everything went silent again. My buddy nudged me while we were walking and indicated up the top of a hill next to the river. I looked up through the trees and was just able to make out the figure of the same woman, same clothes and all, just standing there. I couldn't tell if she was looking at us, but she was standing there. My buddy told the girls he thought he saw a mountain lion following us, and he was just going to go scare it off. He hustled up the hill, making a lot of noise, and came back down 10 minutes later. He said he scared it off to the girls, but told me that when he made it to the top, the woman wasn't there. We found the waterfall and put it out of our minds as the girls decided to skinny dip in the river. We hiked back to camp and found it a mess. It wasn't totally trashed, but it was clear something had gotten into our stuff. We told the girls it was probably raccoons, and we both took our guns to bed with us. That night shit went sideways. I remember waking up because my crush was squeezing my arm, as we had been cuddling up together. I opened my eyes, and she hushed me before I could ask what was wrong. There was complete silence all around the tent. I looked across the tent, and my buddy was sitting halfway up looking around. We both stayed awake for the next 2 hours, until the sun started coming up, and then packing our stuff, and we headed out. The entire hike back to town was eerie silent. There were a couple of points where I thought I saw the woman through the trees, but never got a clear sight of her. We avoided the lake completely, and got back to the truck in what seemed like half the time it took us to get out to the camp. After we were safely on the road, the girls and my buddy all started to tell everyone about moments that they thought they saw/heard a woman all weekend, but were too freaked out to mention it out loud, like she would go away if we ignored her. The wild part of this is that none of us could describe her face. It's almost like it were blurry. No idea who she was, but I've never been hiking or camping at night since. In the late 80s, I was in my early 20s, and 2 friends and I went camping in Central Florida. 2 of us were working for the Park Service at the time, so we were able to camp for free in other parks in the state. Both of us had done a lot of camping before. Me, I grew up camping with my family on every single vacation, all over the state. For the other friend with us, this was her first camping trip ever. We were camping in the youth area, which was empty that weekend and was quieter and more isolated than the regular campsites. Later in the afternoon, on the second day of our trip, we were all sort of spread out in the area of the campsite, being within shouting distance but enjoying a little solitude. I was collecting firewood. Every now and then, I'd kind of feel like someone was watching me. I'd look around and see and hear nothing, and then shrug it off, and go back to what I was doing. Later on, at around sunset, we had the bonfire started. One of the rangers, who lived on site about a quarter of a mile away, came over with a truckload of firewood and a 6-pack of beer. We all sat around talking for a while, well after dark, and we could suddenly hear what was probably a bunch of teenagers fooling around on one of the trails a couple of miles away. Since the trails were closed at sunset, the ranger and my co-worker drove off to shoo them back to their campsites. My other friend and I were just relaxing around the fire, talking a little, mostly enjoying the night and the peace and quiet. All of a sudden, I had a cold chill overcome me. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and out of nowhere, I was terrified. I tried to ignore it, but it kept building. I didn't say anything to my friend, I didn't want to scare her. Then I glanced over at her, just as she glanced at me, and she said, "Do you feel that?" "Yeah," I said. "I think maybe we better go to the car." We both felt like we were in deadly danger, but no idea from what. We started walking at a casual pace, not wanting to appear scared. Then halfway to the car, we looked at each other again and simultaneously broke into a dead run. We reached the car, jumped in and locked the doors, and turned the headlights on as we sat there. I was there with my pistol, feeling like it was totally inadequate for whatever was out there. We both just sat there looking straight ahead. We were too afraid to look around. I had the feeling at one point that if I turned my head to look out the window, I would see something that would drive me insane. I don't know how long we sat there. It was probably just a few minutes, but it felt like forever. And then it just left. We could actually feel the feeling go away. A few minutes after that, the other two returned in the truck. We kind of laughed it off afterwards, but I tell you, I've never been that scared before or since. I've faced a lot in my life, and nothing has so completely terrified me like that. I don't know what it is, but I am still convinced that we were in terrible danger. I went on a group retreat type thing over a fall weekend about 8 years ago. It was my husband and our 3 little girls, all under age 10. This was an annual occurrence, but we were flush that year as a result of our company doing well. As a result, we avoided the communal bunkhouses and decided to rent a camper. The RV rental place explained that it would cost the same for 3 nights as it would for 2, so we decided we would return it on Monday, despite the retreat being over earlier on Sunday. So the weekend went great. It was super hot, and we were happy to have air conditioning. We didn't notice it at the time, because different people being in and out all day and not staying in the RV so much over the weekend because of activities. But the previous renters hadn't bothered to clear out the septic lines in the camper, and by 6 Sunday evening, it stunk horribly and was backing up into the toilet. My husband was anxious about the rental company blaming us, so he decided to go to the Walmart in the neighboring town for some Drano. Mind you, in this particular location, while open all year, it's rarely occupied outside of retreats. I'll confess that we haven't been back since this occasion, so the details of why don't really come to mind. But as I recall, it was privately owned by a church in the area, and they used it mostly for their own purposes and events. So my husband leaves around 8:30 for Walmart. It's an hour plus round trip, thanks to the rural area and skinny back roads. I start straightening the camper, packing our belongings and getting the kids settled. He'd been gone for about 40 minutes, when I had gotten everything squared away and delivered the last glass of water to an overexcited child who'd been on the move all day and was having trouble relaxing. I curled up in bed to read and wait for my husband to get back, in case he needed help. The lights had been out for about 20 minutes when I started hearing a clicking sound coming from the window behind the desk. I went still instantly and ran through a self-reassuring checklist. Is the tree scraping the glass? Could it be nature? Maybe a sound in the environment nearby? Or an axe murderer? That was an option too. I got up and walked very slowly towards the kitchen. The noise followed. As I was climbing up into the loft area over the trunk can, I heard the kitchen door rattle. and that's when the scraping sound was heard. I'd gotten a knife as I passed through the kitchen, which I was sweatily clutching as I hauled down onto the edge of the bed in the loft, guarding my children. I eyed the cabin, making sure every access point was locked, and hoped that whoever it was definitely a whoever at this point, would go away. I leaned left and right, trying to get signal on my cell to call camp security, or my husband, or anyone, but it wouldn't dial. I waited, panicking. It was about 5 minutes of torture later that I saw headlights through the portholes on the side, coming along the winding road to the RV sites, as my husband entered the cabin, looking at me weird. He scoffed at me for being a city girl, and told me that people didn't break out of prison and attack women and children in random campgrounds. I expressed that I heard the door rattling, and that it wasn't a coincidence of nature, and he brushed me off. We passed the test of the night without incident, though I was too on edge to sleep. The next morning, we drove into the town to return the RV. On the once-over demanded by the rental agreement, the manager came around to my husband and asked if he knew what happened to the rear window. It seemed that someone had used a switchblade or something similar to remove the gasket from around the window where the back bedroom was, where I'd been reading the night before. There were gashes in the paint consistent with knife marks, and the gasket had been sliced off. The window lock was also damaged. It seemed whoever had done it had also tried inserting the knife into the door's lock, between the jamb and the lock, in another attempt to gain entry. Fortunately, they didn't get in, and we were not charged for the damage to the RV. Needless to say, I never consented to go on a solo camping trip again. We will only go in large groups now. Safety in numbers and all of that. It still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Growing up in the woods and going camping, my family and I have our fair share of bizarre and scary stories. This one, I just can't seem to wrap my head around, even to this day. My parents owned around 35 acres of property in the deep Rockies, about 2 to 3 hours away from our home. We spent as much time there as we could camping there, as we all loved it. It was secluded and beautiful, and we had a lot of freedom there as kids. My parents were both experienced campers and backpackers, and had both grown up in the mountains. One day, we head up at night, arriving at the property around 9 or 10 p.m. We were all tired, and started to unpack the tents and such from the car. The minute we get out though, we all get a strange feeling. It didn't feel normal or good. We had encountered wild predators at this point, and knew the feeling of being watched. But this was like being watched from all sides. We also all noticed that there were no sounds. It was dead silent. Normally we would all be hearing the insects, the occasional owl, and nighthawks or bats, and just the general hum of a forest. Nothing. We all kind of laughed nervously, and maybe mentioned a few things, but got to work and started setting up our tents nearby. This is when the strange stuff really started to occur. We began to hear rustling in the branches around us, about 10 feet off the ground. It almost sounded like large creatures, monkeys or raccoons, jumping from tree to tree, loudly, and many of them. I've never ever seen a raccoon have the ability to do anything like that, and these sounds were clumsy, unlike birds. It gets louder and louder, and becomes extremely unnerving. At this point, the tent is set up, and my parents put my brother and I in there, telling us to stay inside. They go out with flashlights, trying to make sense of this bizarre activity. As they wait outside, we start to hear these bizarre calls. I've never heard of anything like it before, or since, and honestly, it almost sounded like humans were mimicking some kind of primate holler or screech. There was a very odd, human-like aspect to it, and it was like they were all calling and responding to each other from every direction, along with the branches crackling and rustling. My parents came back to the tent to tell us that they couldn't see anything at all. I remember how shocked and frightened my mother looked, and it scared me because she was a badass, and she would stalk bears to get a good picture. Both my parents were not easily frightened in nature, or at all. We're all huddled together in the tent, confused and scared, unsure of what to do. The sounds were all so loud and everywhere. It almost sounded like a crazy storm outside. Even our dogs cowered in between us all, totally freaked out. So my dad decides to go out again, and I remember as he finished unzipping the tent, the sound stopped. Just like that, in an instant, and the oppressive weird feeling was gone. He and my mum go out to investigate, and again, find nothing, except fallen branches and some strange marks up high on some trees. They come back, talk us down, and somehow manage to get us to sleep. We still talk about it to this day. None of us knows what happened, and have no explanation. Like I said, we had some crazy and strange things happen to us, but never anything remotely similar to what happened that night. I really love through hiking and climbing, so I sleep outside for great parts of summer each year, and almost never use a tent, because they're heavy and are also prohibited in most parts of the mountains I go to. I've had many scary encounters with animals, mostly due to the inhuman shrieks they can produce. But I tell you this, in all of the nature, nothing is as scary as people. This is why I prefer camping deep in the woods, to just be outside the city limits. Because it's always better to find a family of wild hogs going through your stuff at 3 a.m. to find a family of coked out drug addicts going through your stuff at 3 a.m. But anyway, here are my two stories of encounters. The first. We were actually using tents this time, because this was more of a get-together and drink thing with my classmates at a nearby lake. So the night is surely upon us, and we decide to gather some wood in the nearby forest to keep the fire going through the night. Me and my pal take the task, and as we approach the wood, we see that there is another tent pitched right out of sight of our campsite. As we pass it, a dude pops out of the tent. We make friendly small talk about us staying there and him just camping and whatnot, and then we excuse ourselves that we need to go fetch some wood for the fire. All fine and dandy, nothing unusual. Camping folk are usually chatty and friendly, except for two things. By the setup of the tent and camping ground, he must have been there for a few days, as he planned to stay there for a while, which is okay. There are a lot of photographers doing this at this place, as it is famous for its sunrises, although I still shiver thinking about all the heavy tarps lying around. And secondly, he advised us to split, as there were two paths going through the woods, so that we could cover more ground, which we did, because why not? He looked like he knew the area. So I'm walking alone through the woods, my mate taking the other path, which was directly above mine, so he could still see down on my trail. When I hear him shout my name, I turn around and see what's happening, and I see the guy from the tent following me on the trail, which he saw from above, wielding a machete. The guy says that after we left, he realized we didn't have an axe or anything to chop down the wood, although we did say we were collecting the wood, and also chopping it down would be illegal there, so he thought he'd help me with that, which I politely refused and got the hell out of there, meeting my mate who was already on his route there. So we came back to the campsite with next to no fuel for the fire, and everyone kept making fun of us that we're all paranoid and the guy surely wanted to help. Whatever. We proceed to drink, and night falls. We almost forgot about the incident, and all is swell, when I see a hard lamp approaching our campsite. It's that guy from the tent coming. He's bearing a bunch of wood in his arms, and saying that he knew we didn't make much of the fuel, so he gathered some for us. Then he walks all around our campsite, before putting it down. I mean, there was really no need for that, as the fire was in the middle. Checking the tents, asking whether this is all of us, or if someone else is coming. Not creepy nor suspicious at all. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, he tells us to enjoy our night, and gets out of our hair. Understandably, everybody is creeped out by now, and different theories pop up, such as that he bought the wood only to make sure that we wouldn't kill the fire before we go to sleep, so that he knows when that happens, or that the occasional flash from the direction of his campsite is the flash from his binoculars. Well, no one went to sleep that night, and we were not drinking anymore. After the sun went up, it took 2 hours of nap rotation and guarding, and we packed our shit and left as soon as possible. The other incident I had is when we were on a climbing trip and slept under the stars, really deep in the woods, and well off all known trails. The place that we were at, it was prohibited for anyone to be off the trails, which is exactly what we were doing. The park rangers would issue very large fines if they caught you. So essentially, we were hiding deep in the woods. We cooked some great dinner. Man, nothing tastes so good as MRE after a full day of climbing, as we camped out in the mountains. We drank some wine, talked shit a bit, and went to sleep, as we were all really tired. At about 2 a.m. we were all woken up. There were 4 of us. We heard voices, shitloads of voices. It sounded like a school trip somewhere in the distance. Lots of kids talking to each other, presumably walking in a large group. That itself was scary as hell. There were a bunch of kids walking in the woods at 2 a.m., and they must have been off any trail, as we went on purpose out of the reach of any known trails. None of us are talking, and we're all listening as the voices pass. Then the second wave of similar groups of voices pass nearby, and then we hear someone approaching our site through the woods. There must be more of them based on the sounds that they're making, and then it happened. It was a group of 5 kids, roughly 13 years old, walking in the direction of our voices. They were around our site, silently greeting us and nodding in our general direction as they passed about 3 meters from our sleeping bags and continued towards all the voices. To make it all more creepy, none of them had any headlamp or flashlight or any light source at all. It was a full moon, so the visibility was good, but still, I have no idea what that was supposed to mean. But it was really weird and honestly scary. It could have just been scouts, as this was a well-established outdoorsy place. The whole area was. But still, a bunch of kids alone in the woods, well off any known trail, walking without any source of light at 2 a.m. just isn't right by us. There are lots of weird things happening when you camp, but trust me, nothing is as scary as encountering other human beings. I was camping in a valley by myself, with no self-service. I stayed late on a trail and ran into a nice local dude as it was getting dark. He showed me a local camping spot close to the road and the river, but camouflaged. I had a fire, drank beer, and listened to my friend's comedy podcast. I was loud and visible. Because it was dark already, I decided to sleep in the back of my truck, under my topper, next to all my gear, as opposed to setting up my tent. The next morning I made a fire, cracked a beer and started making breakfast. Then I noticed that there is a man at the edge of my camp. He comes closer, but never looks directly at me. This dude looks homeless, has a long ratty beard, and has at least 100 plastic grocery bags tied all over his clothes. I comment about how nice the day is, and get no response from him. I offer him breakfast. Nothing. He sort of paces around the perimeter of my camp. I offer him a beer, but he just turns around, and the dude is just standing there, with his back to me, wandering around. I'm realizing that there isn't going to be any good happenings. I had my bear spray and my buck knife super close. I give him an ultimatum. You're either going to acknowledge me or leave immediately. He ignores me. I grab the bear mace and walk a few steps closer, and he skulked away, and I threw my shit into my truck and left real quick. I wondered if he was watching me during the night, and I think my laziness for staying in my truck instead of a tent. When I was a kid, around 8 or 9, my mum, grandma, brothers and I went camping at a small campground about 2 hours from the town we lived in. We went there a lot, and even had a particular campsite we had slowly built up over the years. On this particular trip, we had my aunt and my uncle's dog with us, since they were doing military tours. They were both well-trained bird dogs, but are usually really calm and friendly. The first night on this particular trip, and Star starts growling in the tent at about 1 in the morning. My mother thinks something is outside and arms herself as she investigates with the dogs. As she gets out of the tent, Star and Ariel would not let her move to the other edge of the campsite, and both get into an attack position, while herding my mum towards the car. This is while also keeping themselves in front of our tent. By this point, we're all up and with a group of kids under 10 freaking out. For a reason she can't even explain today, my mother packs up camp, gets us all into the car and heads home. After about 10 minutes of leaving the campsite, a car starts following us, and the dogs get into the back and start to growl. By this point, everyone was in borderline panic mode, and my brothers were crying the entire car ride home. As the town came into view, you have to cross a huge bridge to drive in, and the car was still behind us, following. And as a kid, you make stories to yourself that nothing is wrong, and the car behind you is just full of scared people too. Yet, as we start across the bridge, the car stops and turns around at full speed, going back the way we came. We stopped at a gas station, and everyone was near meltdown mode, and my mum goes in and gets a pack of cigarettes and starts burning through them. But Star wouldn't let her back into the car, until she could see her clearly. This, and a camping trip a few years later, convinced me that camping is no longer my thing. I went on a group camping trip in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, only to awake and hear something sniffing the outside of our tent. My immediate reaction was that it was likely a bear or some animal that came across our sight, and just maybe my dumbass friend didn't tie up the garbage. Seconds later, I can hear the sniffing go to the tent next to ours, and everyone in mine grabs one another quietly to acknowledge we're all awake and we're aware of what's happening outside. Moments later, a friend in another tent popped out and started to scream and make noise. He had a gun too, hoping it would scare off whichever animal was in our sight. Turns out it wasn't an animal. It was some guy who had gone through our coolers/food and decided it would be okay to sniff our tents. Our friends chased him off, and we immediately packed our shit and left. About a year after that incident, my dumbass friend and I went back to the nearby area, thinking that what we encountered was a one-time incident. This time, we thought we would outsmart any possible creepers, and instead of camping in our tents, we all slept in the beds of our trucks and SUVs. It's the middle of the night. I'm passed out in the back of my SUV, when I feel a bright light on my face. Naturally, I would have woken up, cussed, and asked who the hell was doing that. However, I instantly knew to pretend to be asleep, and not to let the individual know I was awake. I lay there next to my girlfriend, hoping that she would do the same, and I kept an ear out for any unusual sounds, like sniffing. All I could hear was a friend snoring by the campfire. After the light left my car, I had the person walk to the next truck and shine his light on my friends in there. I slowly looked up, and it ended up being some older guy, just standing there staring at everyone when they slept. I waited until he left the campsite, and I busted my ass out of that truck, woke up my friends, which most had been pretending to be sleeping anyway, and we got the hell out of there. The scariest thing to happen to me whilst camping was when I was with my wife, and we were in a windstorm. I am talking trees being blown over, branches falling, the works, in a forest full of jack pine. The creepiest was camping with my best friend. We were in a semi-remote camping area, usually drivable to get to it, but definitely only with a 4x4. It was a semi-maintained camping area, as there were a couple of fire pits, and a few rotten picnic tables and a run-down outhouse. Parks checked this place maybe once a year or so. So when we get there and started setting up, my buddy wanders over to the shitter and opens the door. He hangs there for a second or two and then closes the door and goes to the second one and comes out a few minutes after. He comes to me and says to go look into the first one. I assume that someone has defecated on the floor, or that an animal has got stuck in there and died. Nope. 3 full backpacks. And I'm talking big backpacks, like the bag I have, that size, the ones I use for a week-long trip. So we're nosy, and we open them up. 2 are full of good quality gear, nothing unusual. And the third is full of Skittles. Bulk bags, small bags, regular, tropical, sour, every flavour and size of bag you can imagine. Just full of Skittles. We camped for 4 days and never saw a soul. The bags were still there when we left. We let the COs know when we got to civilization. Who left all that gear? Why did one person pack 80 litres of Skittles? I don't know, but it was weird. Oh, another scary one. The dog and I were backpacking, spur of the moment overnight trip. Wasn't far off the road or anything. So I just have a tarp up that I use as a small shelter and have a small little fire going. Wasn't really hiding per se, but wasn't being obvious. And I was just dozing off when I hear a truck rip up with a bunch of drunken voices, and then the shooting started. They probably didn't know I was there. I was parked off a different road and hadn't realized I had walked as close by as I had to the second one. But still don't like being in an area when a bunch of drunken yahoos are shooting off guns, especially when I was fairly certain that they were shooting in my direction, based on the lay of the land. So I put the dog on a tight leash and headed out ASAP. My wife and I were camping alone in a kind of remote area, but there were little campsites made by the park department that were flat and clear. We found a great looking spot, but it was right on a lake, which I thought was to be avoided. But we were beginner backpackers and figured the park department wouldn't make a spot there if it wasn't safe. So we set up camp mid-afternoon. I was feeling like a beast, so I took a short nap while my wife read a book. When I woke up, she told me that someone was walking around in our campsite. I looked around but didn't see anything. There were some other campsites maybe 500 feet away, so I figured it was another camper checking the place out. Late that night, after we'd gone to bed for the night, it was drizzling a little rain, and I was sort of half asleep at about probably 2 or 3 a.m. Then I realized that if I listened really closely, I could hear someone walking around our campsite very quietly. I didn't have a knife or any sort of weapon and started freaking out. I carefully woke up my wife to get her ready as we listened together. Then suddenly we heard it. It sounded like a cat was cleaning itself. We have cats. And then more walking around in circles around the tent. Then the sound of a large cat lapping up water just feet from our tent. Then walking back into the tent immediately beside me. I heard it flop down onto the ground. Cat owners know how a relaxed cat flopped over. It was like that, but way bigger. I was trying to control my breathing as carefully as I could, so that it wouldn't hear me, but I was so panicked it was quite hard to do. It hung around for what seemed like ages. I had to pee really badly, but I wasn't ready to move or breathe, let alone go out there. The scariest part is that the whole time it was so quiet that if you didn't concentrate, you couldn't be sure it was even there at all. So when I thought that it actually left, as I hadn't heard it in a long time, I very cautiously poked my head out and didn't see anything, even though it was pitch black. I did my business and went back to bed. The next morning we get up and there are massive paw prints in our campsite. Looks like a cat paw print, but more like 8 inches across. Later, after getting home, I called the park ranger to let them know, in case they're monitoring encounters with dangerous animals or something. I don't know, I'm not a wilderness expert. And they told me that it must have been a mountain lion, and how lucky I was to have an encounter with one. When I think about my wife telling me that someone was in our campsite around 12 hours earlier than that encounter, it creeps me right out to think that we might have been stalked by a mountain lion for some time. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you've enjoyed our camping trip tonight. If you did, please don't forget to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts down below. Also, I do post every night, so why not make good and hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to to be updated every time I post and never miss an upload. If there is a story that you would like to share and have read on Mortis Media, feel free to send it to my email, or alternatively, post it to my Reddit page. Just be sure to include plenty of descriptive language, punctuation, and paragraphing, as that will maximize the chances of your story being selected. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.